I never thought I'd end up spending my nights in a place like this, but life has a strange way of leading you where you least expect. For the past 5 years, I've worked as a grave digger in this old cemetery on the outskirts of town. People always ask me if it's spooky, being surrounded by the dead every night. But, honestly, the dead don't scare me. It's the living you have to worry about. At least, that's what I used to think. My shifts were always the same. Quiet, uneventful, with only the occasional howl of wind or distant rustle in the trees to break the silence. My friend, Mark, worked with me most nights. He's younger, more curious, the kind of guy who likes to question everything. We'd pass the time talking about nothing and everything, watching the stars while keeping the graves tidy. But this night was different. It started like any other. Me and Mark leaning against our shovels, listening to the night settle in around us. The cemetery had a way of swallowing sounds, making everything feel distant, as though we were the only 2 people left in the world. "Hey, you see that?" Mark's voice cut through the silence. I looked up, following his gaze. At first, I thought it was just the moon playing tricks on my eyes, casting shadows where they shouldn't be. But then I saw it, flickering lights, just beyond the oldest row of graves. They weren't like the lanterns we sometimes kept lit by the entrance. These lights blinked and moved, darting between the headstones, as though they were alive. Mark was the first to speak, his voice tinged with excitement. "We should check it out." I hesitated. My gut told me to leave it alone. There were plenty of things that couldn't be explained, especially in a place like this, and I had no intention of finding out what those lights were. But Mark, always the inquisitive one, started walking toward them before I could protest. "Come on, man," he called over his shoulder. "It's probably just some kids messing around." I wasn't convinced, but I followed him anyway. Maybe it was my own curiosity, or maybe I just didn't want to leave him alone out there. The lights flickered again, further ahead now, as if they were beckoning us to follow. My unease grew with each step. The closer we got, the colder the air seemed to become, the wind picking up just enough to send a chill down my spine. We passed row after row of graves, some so old the names had worn away from the stones. The flickering lights danced between them, drawing us deeper into the heart of the cemetery. Mark stayed a few steps ahead, more confident than I felt. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting something to jump out at us from the shadows. "It's gotta be something electrical, right?" Mark asked, though it sounded like he was trying to convince himself more than me. "Maybe some weird reflection from the streetlights?" I didn't answer. By now, we were too far from the entrance for it to be anything as simple as a reflection. Something wasn't right, and I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. As we ventured deeper, the cemetery seemed to shift around us. What once had been familiar paths and neatly lined graves now felt like an endless maze of stone and shadow. The lights ahead blinked and pulsed, always just out of reach, luring us farther into the unknown. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand on end, a sense of dread creeping in. Mark pressed forward, undeterred, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It wasn't the comforting stillness of the dead that surrounded us. It was something else, something alive. I wanted to turn back, but I didn't dare say anything. Mark would laugh it off, and maybe that was worse than the fear itself. "Just a little further," he said, his voice almost drowned out by the wind that had begun to howl through the trees lining the cemetery's edge. "We're close." Close to what? I wondered. The lights flickered again, this time splitting in two, like they were multiplying. My heart pounded in my chest. The graves around us grew older, some barely recognizable as gravestones anymore, weathered and cracked, almost swallowed by the earth. We were in the oldest part of the cemetery now, a place we usually avoided during our shifts. Mark slowed down, finally feeling the weight of the situation. He stopped in front of a large crypt, its stone door slightly ajar. The lights hovered near it, their glow casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. "What the hell is this?" Mark muttered, taking a step back. His confidence wavered for the first time. I wanted to tell him that we should leave, that nothing good ever came from following lights in a place like this. But the words wouldn't come. I was frozen, caught between the urge to run and the strange pull of whatever was happening around us. Standing there, in front of the crypt, a memory stirred. I had heard stories, legends passed down by the older gravediggers when I first started working here. Stories about lights, just like these, that would appear late at night. They called them soul fires, claiming they were the spirits of those who couldn't find peace, forever wandering between the living and the dead. But I had never believed in that sort of thing. Not until now. Mark was the first to break the silence. "This is getting weird, man," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Maybe we should." A loud crack echoed through the cemetery, interrupting him. The ground beneath us trembled, and for a moment I thought it was an earthquake. But then I saw it, the crypt's door, slowly swinging open, as if beckoning us inside. "We need to go," I said, my voice hoarse. "Now." But Mark wasn't listening. He was staring at the lights again, which now seemed to drift toward the open crypt. His face was pale, and I could see the doubt flickering in his eyes. "What if the stories are true?" he whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The truth was, I was starting to believe them too. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around and run, to get as far away from that crypt as possible. But something kept me rooted to the spot, a strange, unexplainable force pulling me toward it. Mark took a step closer to the door, drawn in by the flickering lights. I reached out to grab his arm, but it was too late. He was already inside. I stood frozen in place, watching as Mark disappeared into the crypt. The flickering lights followed him, their eerie glow casting long shadows on the stone walls. For a moment, all was silent. My breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't bring myself to move. Every fiber of my being told me to run, to leave this place and never look back. But something, maybe guilt, maybe fear, kept me rooted to the spot. Then I heard it, Mark's voice, faint at first, but growing louder. He was calling for me. "Hey, get in here." His voice echoed out of the crypt, but something in his tone felt off. It wasn't excitement anymore. It was panic. Against my better judgment, I stepped forward, peering into the darkness of the crypt. The air inside was thick and damp, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I could barely make out Mark's figure standing near the far wall, his back to me. The lights danced around him, brighter now, almost blinding in their intensity. "Mark," I called out, but he didn't turn around. He just stood there, motionless. A cold chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. I took a step closer, but as I did, the ground beneath me seemed to shift, like the very earth was moving. I stumbled, catching myself against the stone wall. That's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moved, something lurking in the darkness beyond Mark. "Mark, we need to go," I said, my voice trembling. But he didn't respond. I took another step, and that's when Mark finally turned to face me. His eyes were wide, his face pale as a ghost. "We're not getting out of here, man," he whispered, his voice shaking. "They won't let us." "What are you talking about?" I asked, confused and frightened. "The lights. They want something. They want us." Panic surged through me. I grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the entrance, but he resisted. That's when I realized Mark wasn't trying to leave. He was trying to stay. "We have to give them something," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They won't let us go unless we do." I stared at him, horrified. "What are you saying?" Mark's eyes flickered with desperation. One of us has to stay. It's the only way. The weight of his words crashed over me like a tidal wave. He was serious. He was willing to sacrifice me to save himself. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. This was my friend, the guy I had worked with for years, the one who always had my back. But now, standing in the grip of fear and madness, he was ready to betray me, to leave me behind. "Mark." "No," I said, my voice barely audible. But he didn't listen. He lunged at me, and I stumbled back, my heart racing. In the struggle, I tripped over something cold and hard, the edge of a stone sarcophagus. I hit the ground, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Mark stood over me, his eyes wild with fear, his face contorted with desperation. "They won't let us go unless we give them something," he repeated, his voice rising in panic. "It's the only way." I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. I had to think, had to find a way out of this. The lights were all around us now, swirling like fireflies, their glow pulsing in the darkness. The crypt felt alive, like the walls were closing in, the air growing heavier with each passing second. "Mark, listen to me," I shouted, backing away from him. "We don't have to do this. We can find another way." "There is no other way," he screamed, lunging at me again. This time, I was ready. I dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding his grasp. My mind raced, searching for a solution. And then I remembered the legend. The old gravediggers had always said that disturbing the oldest grave in the cemetery could break the curse. It was a long shot, but it was the only hope I had left. My eyes darted to the far corner of the crypt, where the oldest sarcophagus stood. Its stone lid was worn and cracked, covered in dust and cobwebs. If the stories were true, this was it. This was where it had to end. With Mark still coming at me, I bolted toward the sarcophagus, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached it just as he grabbed at my arm, trying to pull me back. But I was faster. I threw myself against the stone lid, pushing with all my strength. The lid slid open with a deafening scrape, and a rush of cold air hit me in the face. Inside, the ancient remains of whoever had been buried there lay undisturbed, shrouded in darkness. The lights flared brighter for a moment, blinding me with their intensity. Mark let out a scream that was cut short as the crypt itself seemed to shudder. The lights flickered, then dimmed, and just like that, they were gone. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, my body shaking from the adrenaline. The crypt was silent now, the oppressive presence of the lights gone. But Mark was nowhere to be found. I looked around, my heart sinking. He was gone, taken by the very lights he had been so desperate to escape. And I was alone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing down on me as I tried to process what had just happened. The crypt, once alive with the strange pulsating lights, now felt like any other abandoned tomb, cold, lifeless, and eerily quiet. My hands shook as I pushed myself off the floor, my body aching from the struggle. But none of that compared to the hollow feeling settling in my chest. Mark was gone. The wind howled outside, a reminder that the world outside the crypt still moved, but I felt stuck, paralyzed in the reality of what had just transpired. I wanted to believe he had run off, maybe fled the cemetery in a panic, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The lights had taken him. Whether they had claimed his body or his soul, I couldn't say, but I knew I wouldn't see him again. As I stepped out of the crypt, the cold night air hit me like a slap to the face, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat inside. I walked, my legs shaky, back toward the newer section of the cemetery. The gravestones were more familiar here, names I had read countless times over the years. But nothing felt the same. Not anymore. The lights were gone, but their presence lingered like a shadow at the edge of my thoughts. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting them to return, to flicker back into existence and finish what they had started. My mind raced with thoughts of the legend, of the souls lost and wandering, desperate for company. Was that what had happened to Mark? Had he become one of them? I couldn't stay here. Not anymore. I returned home that night, but the sense of relief I had hoped for never came. The four walls of my small apartment felt like a cage, closing in on me with every passing minute. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the lights, flickering, darting between gravestones, pulling Mark into their grasp. I heard his voice, desperate, terrified, calling out for help that never came. I thought about leaving town. Maybe that would be enough to put this nightmare behind me, to escape the weight of what I had seen. But something told me it wasn't that simple. Some things you can't just outrun. Days passed, but I couldn't bring myself to return to the cemetery. I called in sick, using the excuse that I wasn't feeling well, but the truth was, I couldn't face that place again. Not after what had happened. I tried to distract myself, to push the memory of that night as far back into my mind as possible, but it kept creeping back, haunting me when I least expected it. Then came the dreams. Every night, I found myself back in the cemetery, wandering through the rows of graves, the lights flickering just out of reach. Mark was there too, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He never spoke, but I knew what he wanted. He wanted me to join him. My name is Daniel, and I've been a bus driver for almost 15 years now. People often think that driving the same route every day must be boring, but for me, it's a sort of quiet escape from the chaos of life. It's predictable, unlike most things. I work the night shift, a routine that suits me. My regular passengers are few, mostly night workers or the occasional lost soul trying to get home. It's been raining heavily all week, the kind of downpour that makes the roads blur into long, glistening streams. I didn't mind it. In fact, the rhythmic patter of the rain on the windshield usually soothed me. Tonight, I had a familiar face with me. Lucas, my friend and colleague, who worked as the conductor. He had a knack for keeping conversation going, which was helpful during those long, quiet nights. The streets were deserted as usual, just the dull hum of the bus engine and the rain to keep us company. We rolled through the route in comfortable silence, only the occasional small talk breaking the monotony. "Think we'll get anyone tonight?" Lucas asked, leaning back in his seat. "Doubt it," I replied. "Not in this weather." Just then, the doors of the bus hissed open at the next stop. It caught me off guard since we hadn't seen anyone for miles. A figure stepped inside, drenched from head to toe. I couldn't make out much about him, except for the way he carried himself. He seemed more like a shadow than a man. He moved to the back without a word, disappearing into the dimly lit seats. Lucas raised an eyebrow at me but didn't say anything. We both knew better than to question night passengers. They were usually just people with places to be, regardless of the hour. But this one, there was something different about him. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I shrugged it off and continued driving, though I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting something to happen. The bus rolled on, the rain outside a constant, unrelenting presence. I could feel the tension in the air, though I tried to ignore it. Lucas shifted in his seat, tapping his fingers lightly on the ticket machine, probably sensing the same thing. Then, the voice came. "Did you know," the passenger began, his tone low and oddly melodic, "that just a few blocks from here, there's a house where no light has ever been seen?" The voice startled me. I hadn't even realized he was speaking at first. It wasn't loud or forceful, but it cut through the silence in a way that made my skin crawl. "Excuse me," Lucas called back, half laughing. "You talking to us?" The passenger didn't respond directly. Instead, he continued with his story, his voice carrying through the bus like a whisper that clung to the damp air. "A family used to live there. They say the man went mad one night and turned off every light in the house before disappearing, taking his children with him. They say you can still hear them, moving through the darkness, even though the house has been empty for years. I glanced at Lucas, expecting him to laugh or brush it off, but he just stared back at me, the usual lightness in his eyes gone. Something about the way the man spoke made it hard to joke. The words weren't just eerie. They felt too real, too close. I wanted to brush it off, pretend it was just a strange passenger trying to pass the time. But as the bus turned onto a dimly lit street, I realized we were passing the very house he was talking about. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, and for a second, I felt like we were driving through more than just rain. The man's voice continued to echo in my mind, the details of his story embedding themselves in my thoughts. Lucas shifted uneasily next to me, and I could tell he was just as affected. "Let's keep moving," I muttered under my breath, though I wasn't sure why I felt the need to say it. The rain seemed heavier now, the bus rolling along in the darkness like it was heading deeper into some place it didn't belong. As we continued along the route, I couldn't shake the lingering unease from the passenger's story. The rain was relentless, hammering against the bus as if trying to force its way in. I focused on the road, but my mind kept wandering back to that house, the one shrouded in darkness. I had driven past it countless times without a second thought, but now it felt different, almost like the shadows clung to it longer than they should. Lucas didn't say much after the passenger's eerie tale. I could tell he was just as unsettled as I was, his usual light-hearted demeanor fading into something more anxious. We didn't speak, but the silence between us was thick with tension, like we both knew something was off but didn't want to admit it. I checked the rear-view mirror, expecting to see the passenger staring back at me, but he wasn't. He was still sitting in the back, shrouded in shadow, his face barely visible. The dim light flickered as we drove, casting strange shapes along the walls of the bus. I felt a cold chill creeping down my spine, like the air itself had turned against us. "Hey," Lucas said suddenly, breaking the silence. "You notice anything weird about that guy?" I glanced at him. "Weird how? I don't know. He just feels wrong, you know? Like he's been watching us the whole time, even when he's not." I didn't want to admit it, but Lucas was right. The passenger hadn't done anything particularly strange, but his presence alone seemed to change the air in the bus. It was like he brought the darkness with him, infecting the space around him. "I'm sure it's nothing," I said, trying to convince myself more than Lucas. "Just some guy trying to pass the time with stories. We've seen weirder, right?" Lucas didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the passenger, and I knew he felt it too. Something was off. The rain continued to pound against the windows, and I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, focusing on the road ahead. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The passenger's voice broke the silence again, soft but sharp enough to cut through the pounding rain. "Strange, isn't it?" he said, his tone calm but chilling. "How certain places seem to cling to people's fears." I felt a lump form in my throat. He was speaking again, but this time, his words felt different, more directed. Lucas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and I could see him clenching his fists, as if bracing for something worse. The passenger didn't stop. "You see, fear is like a shadow. It follows you, even when you think you've left it behind." He paused, and the silence in the bus was unbearable. The rain, the flickering lights, the distant sound of thunder, it all seemed to close in on us. I didn't want to look in the mirror, didn't want to see his face, but I did. He was sitting calmly, his eyes just barely visible under the brim of his hat. His gaze was fixed on Lucas. I swallowed hard. "What's your point?" I asked, trying to sound unaffected, though my voice betrayed me. "Point?" The passenger chuckled softly. "There's no point. It's just an observation. Fear can be a powerful thing, especially when it knows your secrets." My heart raced. His words were becoming too personal, too close to something I didn't want to think about. I glanced at Lucas, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. "Look, man, we don't need your spooky stories," Lucas said, his voice shaking slightly. "We're just doing our job here." The passenger leaned forward slightly, his face still obscured by the shadows. "Oh, I'm not telling stories anymore," he said. "I'm just talking about the truth. Like how some people carry the weight of their past around with them, hiding it, hoping it won't catch up." I froze. It wasn't just a creepy story anymore. He knew. Somehow, this stranger knew things he shouldn't. I had never told anyone about my past, about what had happened all those years ago. The guilt, the fear, it had been buried for so long. How could he possibly know? Lucas shot me a look, his face pale. He could sense it too. This wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was something else, something that shouldn't be here. The bus hit a bump, jolting us back into the present. The rain had intensified, pounding the roof like it was trying to break through. I didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. This night was far from over. The rain hammered down even harder now, and the bus felt like it was being swallowed by the night. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, but my mind was elsewhere, back with the passenger's words, his eerie knowledge of my past. How did he know? The air inside the bus had grown thick, almost suffocating. It felt like the walls were closing in, and Lucas was just as uneasy as I was. His leg bounced nervously, his eyes flicking back and forth between me and the shadowy figure sitting in the back. "I can't take this anymore," Lucas muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to figure out who this guy is. This isn't normal." I couldn't agree more. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my thoughts were racing. Something about this passenger was deeply wrong, and whatever game he was playing, I was tired of it. I had to confront him, or at least try to get some answers. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the bus over to the side of the road, the tires skidding slightly on the slick asphalt. The rain was relentless, but I barely noticed it anymore. The bus sat still, its engine idling, and the only sound was the steady drumming of rain on the roof. I turned in my seat, facing the back of the bus. Lucas followed my lead, though his expression was far from confident. The passenger sat there, his face still obscured by the shadows. It was as if the darkness clung to him, refusing to let the light reveal his features. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice steady but laced with tension. "How do you know so much about us?" For a long moment, he didn't respond. The silence stretched out, unbearable, before he finally spoke. "You already know who I am," the passenger said softly, his voice calm and unhurried. "I've been with you both for longer than you realize, and I'll remain, as long as you carry your fears with you." Lucas shot me a look of confusion and terror, his face pale in the dim light. I felt the weight of the passenger's words settle over me like a heavy fog. He wasn't just some random man with strange stories. He was something more, something that had been with us, feeding off our fears. And now, it seemed, he wanted to confront us with them directly. "Enough with the cryptic talk," Lucas shouted, standing up abruptly. "Just tell us what you want." The passenger's shadowy form shifted slightly, his head tilting as if considering the question. "What I want," he repeated slowly. "I want you to face the truth. Your truth." The rain eased slightly, as if the storm itself was waiting for me to act. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. I turned, finally facing the passenger head-on. His eyes were locked on mine, dark and endless, like two voids that could swallow me whole. But this time, I didn't look away. I couldn't. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice shaking. The passenger didn't smile, didn't move. He simply stared at me, unblinking. "I want you to accept what you've done. To stop running. The past won't change, but you can choose how to live with it." I closed my eyes, the memories of that night flooding back with brutal clarity. The screeching tires, the sudden impact, the sight of the wreckage in the rear-view mirror. I had spent so long pretending it didn't happen, trying to move on, but the guilt had followed me everywhere, clinging to me like a shadow. Tears stung my eyes, and for the first time in years, I let them fall. I let the weight of my guilt crush down on me, fully and completely. There was no more running, no more hiding. I had to face it. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." The passenger didn't respond, but something in the air shifted. The darkness that had filled the bus seemed to lighten, the shadows retreating. The rain outside slowed to a steady drizzle, and the oppressive atmosphere began to lift. Lucas was silent, still processing what I had just told him. I couldn't blame him for not knowing what to say. I had just revealed the darkest part of my soul, and nothing could make that easier to accept. But at least now, it was out in the open. The truth no longer held me prisoner. The passenger stood up slowly, his figure still shadowy but less menacing now. He walked down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. As he reached the door, he turned back to me. "Fear is a powerful thing," he said, "but it only controls you if you let it. You've faced it now. Don't let it rule you any longer." And with that, he stepped off the bus. The doors closed behind him with a soft hiss, and just like that, he was gone. The bus was still. The rain had stopped. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. I sat there for a moment, just breathing, letting the silence settle around me. Lucas was still watching me, unsure of what to say. But it didn't matter. I had confronted my fear. I had faced the truth. And for the first time, the past didn't feel like a weight on my chest. The bus rolled back onto the road, the tires gliding smoothly over the wet asphalt. The night felt clearer now, the road ahead no longer shrouded in darkness. And as I drove through the quiet streets, I realized something. The passenger hadn't been a person at all. He had been a part of me, a part one had finally come to terms with. My life had always been a cycle of monotony, where the clock ticked away the hours in the dim glow of fluorescent lights. I worked the late shift at a small diner on the outskirts of town, a place where the neon signs buzzed softly against the backdrop of darkness. My name is Alex, and my days revolved around greasy plates and coffee refills. The diner was my escape, but the emptiness of the late-night hours often loomed larger than the walls that enclosed us. One night, as I wiped down the counter, my co-worker, Jenna, and I shared our usual banter. She was bold and adventurous, always seeking a thrill beyond our small-town confines. I, on the other hand, preferred the safety of routine, finding comfort in the familiar. The clatter of dishes and the distant hum of the refrigerator filled the air, creating a lull that I had come to expect. Then, the phone rang, a sound that sliced through the silence. It was just past midnight, and the eerie atmosphere seemed to thicken. I exchanged a glance with Jenna. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity and fear. I picked up the receiver, my heart racing as I heard a trembling voice on the other end. "Help me. I'm trapped," it whispered, sending chills down my spine. This was no ordinary call. The voice spoke of dark secrets and unfinished business, thrusting us into a world we had only heard about in whispered conversations, the realm of the vanished. As the voice faded, I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. I glanced at Jenna, her face pale, reflecting my own rising dread. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The name the caller had mentioned struck me like a bolt of lightning. "It can't be," I murmured, recalling the long-ago disappearance of Sarah Miller, a girl from our school who had vanished without a trace. Jenna leaned closer, her curiosity overcoming her fear. "We have to investigate this. What if it's a clue?" She was eager, as always, to peel back the layers of the mystery, while I hesitated, a gnawing sense of dread pulling at my insides. The stories of the missing had haunted our town for years, and now one was calling from the abyss. As we finished our shift, the diner felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, shadows lurking just beyond the neon glow. Jenna was already brainstorming ideas, her mind racing ahead, while I fought to suppress the fear tightening around my chest. After locking up, we walked to my car, the cold night air wrapping around us. "We can't just ignore it," Jenna insisted, her voice filled with a determination I envied. "We owe it to Sarah." Her words echoed in the darkness, and I knew we were already too deep to turn back. The next day, the weight of the night before pressed heavily on my shoulders. As I sat in my cramped apartment, the remnants of the call replayed in my mind like a broken record. Jenna was relentless, buzzing with energy as we gathered information about Sarah's disappearance. We spent the morning digging through old newspaper articles and online forums, each click of the mouse pulling us deeper into the unsettling history of our town. With every piece of information we uncovered, Sarah's last known moments became clearer, revealing whispers of a dark figure lurking near the diner on the night she vanished. "It all connects," Jenna said, her eyes alight with excitement. "We need to trace that call and see where it came from." A mix of fear and intrigue coursed through me. What if Sarah was truly reaching out for help? As night approached, we made our way back to the diner, the birthplace of our chilling mystery. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that felt more pronounced with every step. I felt that familiar sense of dread creeping in, the flickering neon lights casting eerie patterns on the pavement. Once inside, the diner was a ghost of its usual self. The buzzing of fluorescent lights filled the empty space, amplifying the stillness. We settled at the counter, the silence hanging heavily in the air. Just as I thought it might be a quiet night, the phone rang again, its jarring sound echoing through the diner. My heart raced as I exchanged a nervous glance with Jenna. "This is it," she said, determination igniting in her eyes. I reached for the receiver, anxiety coiling in my gut, knowing our lives were about to change forever. "Hello," I answered, trying to sound steadier than I felt. This time, the voice was clearer and dripping with desperation. "You have to listen. They're coming for you." The line went dead, leaving behind an unsettling silence. I looked at Jenna, who was staring wide-eyed, her hands trembling. "Who was that?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. "I don't know," I replied, my mind racing. But it sounded like a warning. The atmosphere shifted, thickening with a palpable tension that made it hard to breathe. Shadows deepened around us, pressing in from all sides. Jenna and I exchanged a glance, our unspoken fears colliding in the dim light. "Let's investigate further," she suggested, her voice steady despite the rising panic. I hesitated, but there was a flicker of determination in her eyes that spurred me on. "We need to figure this out. Staying here won't help us." As the hours dragged on, the diner began to feel less like a safe haven and more like a trap. Strange occurrences erupted around us. The lights flickered more violently, and an unnatural chill swept through the space, thickening the air. I felt an invisible weight pressing down on my chest, a sense of being watched from the shadows. "Let's check the back room," Jenna proposed, her curiosity pulling me along despite my reservations. As we approached the storage room, dread settled deep in my gut, whispering that we were about to uncover something we weren't meant to find. We pushed open the door to the storage room, and the musty air enveloped us like a heavy blanket. Dim light from a single bulb flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows across the stacks of boxes piled high. My heart raced as I stepped inside, the dim space feeling more like a crypt than a storage area. Jenna was already rummaging through the boxes, her determination igniting a spark of courage within me. "Look at this," she exclaimed, pulling out a dusty file. As she flipped it open, her excitement was palpable. The pages were filled with old newspaper clippings about the missing people in our town, including a picture of Sarah. My stomach twisted at the sight, memories of her cheerful face colliding with the reality of her disappearance. "What if there are more connections?" I suggested, trying to stay focused. Each story we read seemed to weave a larger tapestry of despair, a dark narrative that had haunted our community for far too long. As we continued to sift through the papers, a sudden crash echoed from outside, making us jump. The diner's neon sign flickered erratically, casting an unsettling glow through the window. Jenna's eyes widened, and she bit her lip nervously. "Maybe we should go check it out," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Reluctantly, we left the storage room, tension hanging thick in the air. The diner felt even more desolate now. We stepped outside, and a gust of wind swept through the parking lot, sending chills down my spine. I glanced back at Jenna, whose expression mirrored my own anxiety. "What if it's connected?" I asked, feeling the weight of our discovery pulling us deeper into the shadows. The night had transformed. As we stepped into the parking lot, the once familiar diner felt foreign, shrouded in an eerie stillness. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves like hushed voices sharing secrets. I glanced at Jenna, who was scanning the darkened landscape, her eyes searching for signs of what might have caused the noise. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods, barely illuminated by the flickering neon lights. My heart raced, a primal instinct urging me to retreat. "Jenna," I whispered, "do you see that?" "Yeah," she replied, her voice steady but laced with fear. "We should get closer." I hesitated, my instincts screaming to run, but Jenna's determination pulled me forward. As we approached, the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving only an unsettling emptiness in its wake. "It's gone," I said, my voice shaky. "Maybe it was just our imagination." But Jenna shook her head. "No, I felt something. It was watching us." We turned to head back to the diner, but the chilling realization hit me. We weren't alone. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted again. The air was heavy, charged with a sense of foreboding. Suddenly, the phone rang, its shrill sound slicing through the silence like a knife. I glanced at Jenna, both of us frozen in place. "Answer it," she urged, her voice barely a whisper. My hand shook as I picked up the receiver. "Hello," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "Help me." "It's coming for you," the voice on the line rasped, sending icy tendrils of fear crawling up my spine. I dropped the phone, breathless. It was the same voice as before, but now it held a sense of urgency that rattled me to my core. "Alex, what did it say?" Jenna pressed, her eyes wide with fear. I could only shake my head, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing down on us. It was time to face the truth. Whatever was haunting us was drawing nearer, and we needed to uncover the secrets buried within our town before it consumed us. The atmosphere in the diner felt charged, the air thick with tension as Jenna and I exchanged fearful glances. I struggled to process the chilling words that had just echoed in my mind. "It's coming for you." The weight of the warning settled heavily on my chest, making it hard to breathe. "Alex, we have to figure out what's happening," Jenna said, her voice a mix of determination and fear. "What if those calls are connected to the disappearances? We can't ignore this." I nodded, though my stomach churned with uncertainty. "But what if we're putting ourselves in danger? The last thing I want is to become a part of this nightmare." Jenna's expression hardened. "We're already in it, whether we like it or not. If we want to help whoever is calling, we need to dig deeper." Her conviction was palpable, and I felt a reluctant surge of courage rising within me. We decided to revisit the old files we had discovered earlier, hoping to uncover any links that could help us understand the dark force at play. As we pored over the articles, I felt an eerie sense of connection to the stories of the missing. It was as if their spirits were lingering, urging us to continue our search. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, and the temperature in the diner plummeted. Jenna shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "Did you feel that?" she whispered. I nodded, anxiety creeping in. "It's like something's trying to make its presence known." Just then, the phone rang again, a harbinger of the truth we were desperately trying to uncover. I steeled myself, bracing for what would come next. "Hello." I answered the phone, my voice quivering slightly. "Help me." "They won't let me go," the voice pleaded, filled with despair. I felt my heart race as the words echoed in my mind. It was another call, another cry for help that seemed to come from the depths of despair. "Who is this?" I asked, desperation creeping into my tone. But all I heard was silence, followed by a sudden crackle before the line went dead. I turned to Jenna, panic flooding my senses. "We can't keep doing this," I said, shaking my head. "What if we're only making things worse?" "Maybe we are," Jenna replied, her voice steady despite the fear reflected in her eyes. "But we can't just ignore it. If we leave now, we might lose our chance to help." In that moment, I realized we had crossed a line we couldn't uncross. The investigation had already consumed us, pulling us deeper into the abyss of the unknown. "We need to confront whatever is haunting us," I said, a surge of resolve igniting within me. "We have to face this darkness together." We decided to conduct the ritual we had read about in the old legends, believing it could help us reach out to the spirits calling for assistance. We gathered candles and created a makeshift altar in the diner, the flickering flames casting long shadows against the walls. As we began the incantation, the air grew heavy, charged with energy. I felt the temperature drop even further, the chill wrapping around us like a shroud. The atmosphere shifted, becoming dense and suffocating. "Do you think it's working?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling. Before I could respond, a gust of wind blew through the diner, extinguishing the candles and plunging us into darkness. Panic surged as I fumbled for my phone to use as a light. The moment the screen illuminated, I saw her, a shadowy figure standing in the corner, staring directly at us. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Jenna's hand as we sprinted for the door. We burst through the diner doors, the night air hitting us like a cold wave as we stumbled into the parking lot. My heart raced, and adrenaline coursed through my veins as I glanced back at the diner. The darkness loomed behind us, but I could feel the shadow of that figure lingering just out of sight. "Where do we go?" Jenna gasped, her breath coming in quick bursts. "Anywhere but here," I replied, pulling her toward my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I tried to focus on the task at hand. The weight of our experience pressed heavily on me, each second feeling like an eternity as the diner's darkness threatened to swallow us whole. Finally, the car door swung open, and we climbed inside, slamming it shut behind us. I took a deep breath, desperately trying to calm my racing heart. "What just happened back there?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know, but I think whatever it was wants us to find it," I said, my mind racing. "It might be tied to the calls, to everything that's been happening." Jenna's expression hardened. "We can't run away. We need to face it. Finish what we started." With renewed determination, I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. As we drove away from the diner, the headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead. "Where do we even start?" I asked, my mind swirling with possibilities. "I remember reading about an old well outside of town," Jenna said. "Legend has it that it's connected to the spirits who went missing. Maybe we can uncover the truth there." I nodded, the weight of our decision heavy in the air. We were venturing into the heart of darkness, but I felt an undeniable pull to confront whatever awaited us. As we drove toward the well, an unsettling silence enveloped us, broken only by the hum of the tires against the asphalt. The trees lined the road like sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out as if trying to grab hold of our fleeting hope. The thought of what lay ahead both thrilled and terrified me. When we finally arrived at the well, I parked the car under the dim light of the moon, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. We stepped out, the cool night air biting at our skin as we approached the ancient structure. It looked neglected, overgrown with weeds, and surrounded by an aura of despair. "This is it," Jenna said, her voice barely above a whisper. We peered into the darkness of the well, the bottom shrouded in shadows that seemed to whisper secrets of the past. I took a deep breath, steadying myself as I pulled out the flashlight. "Let's see what we can find," I said, shining the beam down into the abyss. As the light danced across the damp stones, something caught my eye. Small trinkets and objects scattered around the opening, remnants of those who had come before us, perhaps searching for answers of their own. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Do you think they were trying to communicate?" I asked, glancing at Jenna. "Maybe," she replied, her eyes reflecting the same fear I felt. "We need to be careful. Whatever is down there may not want to be disturbed." With determination and a sense of urgency, we began to search the area for any clues. Each step we took felt like we were stepping deeper into the unknown, our past haunting us with every breath. Just as we were about to give up, I noticed a glimmer of something near the base of the well. "Look!" I shouted, pointing at the object half buried in the dirt. It was a pendant, a small silver locket, tarnished and forgotten. As I picked it up, I felt a rush of energy, a connection to the souls that had been lost. "We have to find out who it belonged to," I said, holding the locket tightly. "This could be the key to breaking the cycle." As I looked at Jenna, determination ignited in her eyes. "Let's do this together," she said, and I knew we were about to face our greatest challenge yet. With the locket clutched tightly in my hand, Jenna and I returned to the car, a sense of urgency propelling us forward. The night had become a tapestry of shadows, and as we drove back toward town, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, the weight of the past pressing down on us. "Do you think the locket is connected to the calls?" Jenna asked, her voice breaking the heavy silence that had settled in the car. "I do," I replied, feeling the cold metal against my palm. "It's a piece of someone's story, and I think it might lead us to the truth about what happened." We reached the diner, its familiar silhouette looming in the dark. As we stepped inside, the air felt charged with energy. The shadows danced along the walls, almost beckoning us to unravel their secrets. "Let's set up the altar again," Jenna suggested, her eyes filled with determination. "We need to reach out to whoever this locket belonged to." With the locket placed at the center of our makeshift altar, we began the ritual once more, lighting candles and reciting the incantations. The air grew heavy, vibrating with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. As we continued, the lights flickered, and a whisper echoed through the diner. "Help me. I'm lost." My heart raced as I realized that the voice was familiar. "Sarah," I called out, my voice trembling with hope. "Is that you?" "Yes." "I need you to break the cycle," the voice responded, clearer this time. "Use the locket to find me." With renewed purpose, Jenna and I poured our energy into the ritual, focusing on the locket and its connection to Sarah. As we closed our eyes, a warmth enveloped us, and suddenly, the room filled with a blinding light. When the light faded, I opened my eyes to find myself standing in a place that felt both foreign and familiar. An ethereal landscape where shadows danced and whispers of the past lingered in the air. "Follow the light," Sarah's voice urged, guiding us through the mist. We moved together, hand in hand, pushing through the veil of darkness that had plagued our town for so long. Finally, we reached a clearing where the silhouettes of those who had vanished gathered, their expressions a mix of sorrow and relief. "Thank you for freeing us," Sarah said, her face illuminated by a soft glow. "You've broken the cycle." With that, the spirits began to fade, their grateful whispers wrapping around us like a warm embrace. As dawn broke outside the diner, Jenna and I stood together, a sense of peace washing over us. The burden we had carried felt lighter, the darkness that had haunted us dissipating with the first rays of sunlight. "We did it," Jenna whispered, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, we did," I replied, smiling through my own tears. "We faced our fears, and in doing so, we found the truth." And in that moment, we knew we had not only helped the lost souls of our town, but had also discovered the strength within ourselves to confront the darkness and emerge into the light. We've reached the end. Which of these stories did you find most intriguing? Comment below. Thank you and see you later.